Welcome to the Carnivore Cast, the podcast focused on the carnivore diet and lifestyle, with practical advice from successful carnivores, citizen scientists, and top researchers. I'm your host, Scott Meslinski, and I'm here to speak with experts and experienced carnivores to get answers to your biggest and meatiest questions while helping you live your best life as a carnivore. If you enjoy the show, please consider supporting the Carnivore Cast on Patreon. By becoming a patron, you'll help us reach more people and continue to create content on carnivore. There are also exclusive perks available, such as private Q&As, consultations with me, and more. Become a supporter at patreon.com/carnivorecast. Check the episode description for the link. Thank you, and I'll see you there. Robb Wolf needs absolutely zero introduction, but I'll attempt to give him one anyway. He's a former research biochemist considered by many as the founder of the paleo diet, with his New York Times bestselling The Paleo Solution and also Wired to Eat. Robb also cares deeply about regenerative agriculture and improving the health and sustainability of the world through many of his seminars and his recent book and film project, Sacred Cow, with Diana Rogers, which I recommend to everyone. Robb has transformed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people around the world via his podcasts, his books, his seminars, like I mentioned, and he's also worked, which is really cool, with Navy Special Forces, firefighters, the Chickasaw Nation, Keto Marine Corps, NASA, you name it. And finally, he's a badass purple belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Welcome to the show, Robb.
Huge honor to be here, Nate. This shows you how terrible the standards are in jiu-jitsu. I actually got my brown belt. So,
oh, wow. Congratulations. Yeah. I didn't know
so
that. That's awesome.
Clear sign of the end days and the apocalypse in that whole scene. So, yeah.
Cool. Well, I'll have to amend that. And I know you've been working on that for a very long time. So congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. And huge honor to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. So you've been talking about sustainability and helping farmers and ranchers since as long as I've known about you, which is about 2015 Paleo FX. I remember you were on a few panels wearing the shirt that said sustainability greater than abs, yep. And talking about ways to enable the small farmer who, isn't able to legally sell eggs to their neighbor and things like that. How did you first become interested in this topic?
It's a really interesting question. As many interviews as I've done with this, nobody has asked me that. So props to you for that. Very early so I started eating this kind of ancestral life way around 1998, and it was a lifesaver for me, like an absolute lifesaver. And I think it was around 2001, 2002. I was still in and around Seattle at that time. And I remember having a conversation with a guy that was vegan. And he was like, well, that's all well and good for you, but eating all that meat's going to destroy the planet. And I was like, well, how's that going to happen? And he mentioned stuff around climate change and, resource allocation and all this stuff. And I started thinking about this, and I just very back of the envelope and kind of intuitive, but I started chatting with him. I'm like, well, what's the deal with that? Because cows eat mainly grass and they don't have to be finished with grains. And there's no reason to do that unless people want to do that. And it actually kind of flummoxed him. He was like, that's kind of an interesting point, And so, as early as 2000, 2001, I started having some inklings around kind of the thermodynamic inputs and outputs of this story. And thermodynamics is a branch of physics that kind of relates to energy flow and in the energy inputs and outputs of a certain system. And, an example of an unsustainable boondoggle is the production of ethanol from corn. And the claim is that this is green and it's good because you're using less evil fossil fuels to drive things around. But what the irony to all this is that it costs more energy from fossil fuels to make the ethanol than what you get out of it. And this is why the ethanol farmers drive their tractors with oil and diesel and not ethanol. And this is an example of not really kind of emotionality driving something that should be an engineering problem, not an emotional problem. And I believe my first public debate around sustainability and kind of meat inclusive food systems was at California State University, Chico, back in 2006. And it was the local co-op was not doing well financially, and one of the main complaints that they had was that people liked to shop there, but they had to go to that place for certain things and in other places for their meat and animal products. And so that was really a sticky widget for them. They had founded themselves as a vegetarian co-op, and they wanted to maintain that. But maintaining it looked like that it was going to destroy their business, so they weren't going to be around at all. And I believe that the founders of the co-op, or at least the managers, had already decided that they were going to include animal products there, but they had a big public debate to at least put on the theater that the members of the co-op were going to have some sort of an input. But myself and Cindy Daly and some other people from CSU Chico were kind of on like the pro-meat side, and there were some vegetarians and vegans on the kind of anti-meat side. And I had very much the same discussion, which was the once we get past the health considerations, which are actually kind of easy to unpack, and then the environmental stuff, the environment and sustainability piece, it's one of the hottest topics around right now, and it's really kind of a shame because it's so getting taken out of context that it's going to end up being far, far worse than the spoondoggle of thinking that ethanol is a boon from a sustainability perspective. Like, we are adopting other practices that are far, far more injurious to the environment. And ironically, properly managed animal husbandry, particularly animals that eat grass, might actually be a major contributor to mitigating climate change and providing food security, both in the developed world, but in particular the developing world. And so I know that probably ends up being a word salad of a mountain of stuff, but that's kind of been the long arc of this story. And some people will kind of cynically say, well, of course it fits your best interests, like you're pro-meat, so of course you're going to make money by recommending this stuff. I would make way, way, way more money if I had this about face and disavowed paleo and adopted veganism, and even if I kept eating paleo or low carb in my own life, but just had this front facing piece. And if I said, lab grown meat is the one true way to save the planet, I could write some books, do some seminars, get a ton of airplay, and every element of media and social media would have my back. Whereas pushing this notion that meat is actually good for health, good for the planet, and is actually an ethical choice when properly implemented is nearly career suicide. And so the main reason why I do it is I believe pretty strongly that I and people like me have the right of this story. We may not. We may be wrong, but this is something that we need to have a really deep, nuanced conversation around it. And ironically, both myself and many other people in this kind of regenerative ag space have had constant kind of cancel activity. Our accounts getting blocked or banned, shadow banning, people not able to access our stuff. 2.5 years ago, my personal website saw 97% traffic decrease due to a Google algorithm update, which affected a good number of low carb and regenerative ag oriented sites. So we're definitely not on the dominant paradigms favorites list. It's an interesting place to be with all this stuff.
Yeah, super interesting. And a lot of topics you raised there that I want to dive into. I want to get back to that social media and censorship piece, as well as some of the points you raised around like how it would be so easy and you would have the backing of media to go the other way and back lab-grown meats and things like that. But before getting to that, I just want to play out the story a little bit more because I'm super curious. How did you and Diana get together and get inspired to work on Sacred Cow and start this project yourselves?
Oh man, we first met around 2009, I want to say, and Diana had motored along with undiagnosed celiac, the autoimmune gluten reaction, and it was after reading my book and comparing her set of symptoms and experiences with what I reported in the book around 2010 that she was like, I bet I have celiac, and she went and got tested, and she did. And, it was kind of a lifesaver for her. And ironically, like before we recorded, you mentioned that I had talked you out of getting a registered dietetics degree. I similarly tried to talk Diana out of it, and she is
failed.
the hardest working, most stubborn person I have ever met in my life. Like I love her. Other than my wife and kids, I probably love her more than just about any person on the planet. But goddamn if she is not stubborn. And but I think it was good for her, all told, because it gives her a much more credible position to launch, I think, a lot of this stuff from. And we just immediately, so she worked, part of her livelihood was running a regenerative farm there in Carlisle, Massachusetts. And
my backyard.
We knew, yeah, okay, yeah. And we knew that there was going to come a day when animal husbandry was going to be in the crosshairs. Like we just knew it. There was little grumblings here and there, but if I've been good at any one thing in this whole, journey of my career, I've been able to see some stuff very far down the road, sometimes far enough down the road that I don't really know what to do about it. Like I remember in 2003, I told Greg Glassman within like 3 months, when he would have 10,000 affiliates globally within CrossFit. And I just did some back of the envelope kind of, regression analysis around how many strip mall karate places there are, exponential growth of CrossFit, this amount of attrition. And I was 3 months off on it. And I've had a really good number of, it was pretty cool. And he acknowledges that ever so often. But it was around 2010 that both Diana and I was like, they're coming for meat. Like it's going to be this, there will be a day where they will talk about taxing meat. They will talk about not providing loans to meat producers. And this applies particularly to the small-time operator. Folks need to remember that 95% of the food that we consume in the westernized world is controlled by, I believe, 9 companies, something like that. These people aren't going to be hurting for cash or resources, but there were these different areas where I'm like, they're going to come for this decentralized, freedom-oriented kind of food deal. And again, this was 2010, 2011. And so we just started talking about this, and we're just kind of crusty and cranky and kind of it's exciting to help people affect weight loss and diet and lifestyle change. Like it can save lives. It's awesome. But there's a lot of shenanigans in it too. Like I'm kind of old now. I'm almost 50. I'm kind of jacked. I'm not as jacked as Mark Sisson, but I'm reasonably lean, carry a little bit of muscle. So I'm in that like jacked old dude, phase of my career. And what's has made me crazy is if I do a shirtless selfie photo, I get an order of magnitude, sometimes like 2 orders of magnitude greater engagement than if I have this really impassioned piece on metabolism or healthcare or whatever. And I was just like, fuck you assholes. It's just so annoying, and I still want to serve people, but I don't want to serve them schlock. And we just started talking about this, and Diana wanted to do a book and film back around 2010, 2011. I'm like, it's too early. Nobody cares. Literally no one cares right now. And so we just kept chipping away at it. We had, I think, our first co-presentation at like an ancestral health symposium or maybe a PaleoFX around 2013, where we started broaching some topics of sustainability. And then I think you mentioned like 2015, perhaps, that we had started getting some deeper dives. Like I remember there was 1 year. We had 1 year that we did a sustainability panel at PaleoFX, and there were like 30 people there. And then the next year they did a similar sustainability panel, and it was in the big room upstairs, and it was overflowing with people.
Wow.
And this is where I kind of like elbowed Diana in the ribs. I'm like, we're getting there. Like we're getting close. Like enough people are starting to care and to understand about this that we might be able to do something. And so it was around 2016 that we started outlining the book. I'm like, we need to spend a year or so just outlining and researching. Like, and that's what we did. And we started off with a bunch of basic premises, is animal husbandry disproportionately injurious to the environment? Do cattle consume too much water? Do they consume too many resources? Can you have a food system without animals that is sustainable over the time span of thousands of years? And we just went through and we started asking questions and then trying to get in and answer them. We had questions like, is pastured meat significantly healthier than conventional meat? Which, interestingly, it's not. And we can maybe dig into some of that stuff. But an interesting aside with all this, we really expected to catch a lot of heat or shade, depending on how you look at it, from the vegan community. But there have been no negative pieces written from that scene. No slam pieces. And I think it's because we did such a good job on this thing that they just don't want anybody to even look at it. They don't want people to even start doing the compare and contrast. But ironically, we have had a fair amount of pushback from the meat elitists within kind of our own community because we're not 100% emphatic about pastured meat. It's like, yes, we would like to see things move further that way. But something people don't appreciate is that even your conventional meat that ends up in Walmart and Costco, it spends 70% of its life on grass. It is not that far off of regenerative, and chicken and pork are kind of a different story. They are 100% grain and soy fed. And so some of these questions around resource allocation, like food that could be fed to humans is being fed to animals. That's particularly true of pork and chicken, and it's almost completely false of grazing animals like cattle. When there's a final life cycle analysis done on cattle, 86% of what they eat is inedible by humans. And it really wouldn't be hard to take that additional 14% and shift it away if you want to. But the reality is that we do not have a problem of producing too little food for the world. Hunger, as it exists globally, and we detail this both in the book and the film, it exists 100% as a political phenomena. If people are starving, it's because of politics, basically, and particularly in the developed world or developing world. What we really have a challenge, though, is producing enough nutrition. Like we have become so good at producing calories that somewhere around 2005, 2006, we shifted. Nobody knows quite when it was, but we started having more people die from chronic degenerative disease than, starvation, infectious disease, and the stuff that had plagued humanity throughout all of our previous history shifted to being a problem of too many calories and too little nutrition.
Yeah, I'm really glad to hear that you haven't faced that much pushback. I was going to ask that if you've faced significant pushback from farmers or big ag or publishers or anything like that. But yeah, the book. Oh, go ahead.
We did get some pushback, but it was more from like the regenerative ag scene. Like we had one guy in particular that. God, this is stuff that's hard to get into, but I'll just throw it out there. He was suggesting that Diana in particular was racist because she didn't include enough information about like the challenges of BIPOC and minorities trying to enter farming. And, this is definitely we actually did talk about some of that in the book, but we were covering the ethical, environmental, and health considerations of a meat-inclusive food system.
Yeah.
Each one of those subcategories could have a book that's 600 pages long. Our initial manuscript that we turned in was 600 pages, and it got whittled down to almost 300 pages. And I actually think the editors did a very good job. Like, I think it's readable. It makes sense. We didn't lose the important stuff, but you just can't fucking do everything in one piece. It's so, and this guy makes his living by regenerative ag. But he also found kind of a cottage industry of calling people out in the regenerative ag scene and kind of running them down because they happen to be white or whatever. And so we had a really interesting, and that has actually calmed down. Like, I may end up regretting even mentioning that stuff, but there was a good year period of time where Diana was under constant assault and assailment for the perceived slight of just not adding another huge important topic to a book that was already like it was like running the razor's edge, being able to make this book work in a way that the general populace could consume it and come away with something valuable from it. You know, so interestingly, the places that we did get pushback was more from the regenerative ag scene and people I would call the meat elitists. Again, the celebrity chefs and stuff like that say you should either eat grass-fed meat or nothing, basically. So we did get some pushback, and it was interesting and annoying, though, that it was from people who were arguably more of our tribe than less, and the vegans really haven't, knock on wood, thus far really come after us in any significant degree.
This episode is brought to you by Element Electrolytes. We know that salt, potassium, and magnesium are essential minerals, especially for those on carnivore, keto, and low-carb diets to relieve hunger, dizziness, cramps, headaches, and keep so many of your bodily processes running optimally, including sleep, brain and mental health, hormonal health, your heart, immunity, and more. Element Electrolytes are convenient, evidence-based, and delicious. My wife and I have been using Element for years, every single day. They're great for fueling hard workouts, getting adapted and beating keto flu, fasting, traveling with them, and kickstarting your day with energy. They're used by Navy SEALs, Olympic weightlifters, jiu-jitsu athletes, and everyday people who want to make themselves better, like you and me. They're also founded by superhero Rob Wolf. LMNT is offering free, that's right, free, people, Element sample packs to Carnivore Cast listeners. All you have to do is pay for shipping. Go to drinklmnt.com/carnivorecast to claim this awesome deal. That's drinklmnt.com/carnivorecast, one word, and I'll include a link in the show notes. Both the book and the movie are incredibly comprehensive. You go over so many topics and lay out the arguments incredibly logically and support it all with research and evidence where it's available. So I really appreciate that. And how about, this is a topic that I don't think is touched on, I've heard almost at all in our community, but I'd be curious if you ran into it in your research, which is regenerative crop agriculture. So, for example, there's a company here in Boston called Indigo Ag, which creates these genetically modified, quote unquote, super crops, which are meant to restore the soil. And there's this whole side of regenerative agriculture, which is around crops. Did you look into that at all? Or, I guess what's your opinion on that? I think I know, but would love to hear you opine.
I think that there's huge potential on this stuff. But what's interesting when you dig into stuff like that, plants and animals have co-evolved on the planet for billions of years. I forget what the timeline is on like vertebrates emerging and there being an interface between plants and animals, but it's been happening for a long time, at least hundreds of millions of years. And not all plants are directly dependent on animals, but ironically, a lot of them are. One of the an interesting knock-on, we're starting to see interesting knock-on effects. So back in the 20th century, we did some cool stuff, seemingly cool, where we dammed a lot of rivers and a lot of streams, and we developed hydroelectric plants. And this has provided some reasonably clean, reasonably stable energy over, decades of time course. But something that we did is we completely changed the interface of fish like salmon that would used to spawn in these, super inland areas. And what people miss in that is that these fish would go out into the ocean, collect nutrients, including things like phosphorus, which are very rare in the natural environment, and then bring these things sometimes thousands of miles inland, and then spawn and die and be eaten. And that phosphorus and the nitrogen and the other nutrients would be added back into the local, like riparian ecology, and it went as far back into basically there was almost no spot in the United States or Europe that there wasn't like a salmon spawning creek. Like if it ultimately had an output to the ocean, there was some sort of like, salmon as an example there. We're 60, 70, 80 years downstream from this. And what we're starting to discover is that inland habitats are struggling due to a lack of phosphorus. And how the fuck are we going to fix that? This was all solar energy driven by the ecological process of fish migrating from the ocean inland and being part of the food web. And now we're in this kind of like, well, what are we going to do to fix that? And so some of these regenerative, cropping stories are interesting, but when you really dig in and look at what they're doing, they really try to eschew like the use of animal fertilizer, manure and other products, but they will opt in for fish that is caught and harvested and converted into, quote, organic fertilizer. But we're catching fish using fossil fuels, hauling them inland, which requires fossil fuels, processing them, and then administering them to these soils, because you have to have some sort of an outside nitrogen input. And you can do some interesting things like cover crops with nitrogen fixing bacteria as part of, say, like legumes and whatnot. Like there are some interesting pieces that can be done in that story. But up until about the 1940s, the way that this problem was largely solved was a combination of plants and animals. And this is the way it's been done the world over. And it's just interesting the amount of energy and effort that is put into trying to do something different than the way that an ecosystem works. And that's really, I think, maybe one of the primary cases that we make in the book is that we should look to what long-running healthy ecosystems look like, and they're an interface of plants and animals, and different checks and balances within that. So I'm excited about all kinds of developments like that type of stuff. But I think it's also similar to that ethanol story. It's not, when you really do the hard math on that, a life cycle analysis of all the inputs, all the outputs, it's not really sustainable. This isn't something that, like, and particularly if the argument is to really reduce greenhouse gas emissions, particularly from long stored carbon sources like coal and oil that have been underground for hundreds of millions of years, you've got to figure out a way to do it that, it minimizes those inputs. And using large amounts of energy to extract fish or synthetic chemical fertilizers, that really isn't a sustainable process.
Yeah, it's fighting against nature and biology. It just makes so much more sense to try to use those tools to your advantage and put your forces into them and complementing them. This synergistic system with animals and crops working together. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and one thing that isn't sexy about it, though, is that it's pretty clear that some very wealthy folks, wealthy, well-connected, Bill Gates, other people, they have said that they want to run our food system like software. They want it to be scalable. They want it to be intellectual property ownership, available. And so you need these patentable genes, you need patentable processes. And what I'm advocating for is a system that nobody could own the rights to the life that we are, dealing with. That it's plants and animals, and like if a cool variety of wheat is developed, so like Morgan Burlock developed dwarf wheat, which was this amazing advancement and probably forestalled the starvation of hundreds of millions of people. That's amazing stuff. And we should definitely look towards, processes like that. But that also was totally dependent on the inputs of synthetic chemical fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides. And it's the point that we make in the book is that, the more centralized our food becomes, the easier it is for these big multinational corporations to do really unethical stuff. As it stands right now, about 95% of the food consumed in westernized countries is controlled by, I forget if it's 6 or 9 companies. Like it's really kind of jaw-dropping, and they want that control to expand more. And they really have this notion that they are going to, synthetic row crop fertilizer our food system and fake meat us to some sort of a sustainable future. And again, like I tell the story a lot, so I always feel like I've already said things, but I'm never sure if it's in this show or a different show. But that example of the ethanol again, like ethanol is held up as a green alternative to petroleum products, but it costs more energy to produce the ethanol than what you get out of it. Yeah, this is what's happening in these stories. And it's funny when I tell these stories to kids, they get it immediately. And when I try to roll this stuff out to adults, they're still like, there's something here I'm not getting. So I'm struggling on and on to trying to find ever more simple ways of explaining this thing.
Yeah, stranger than fiction. Yes. Which brings me to the point of, you brought up earlier, it being so easy, and this halo effect around being a vegan is being more ethical, it's healthier, it's more sustainable. Why is this message so perpetuated by the media? And what do you think we can do about it?
Man, that's a really good question. And it in the book, we discuss this a bit. And virtually every culture, every society, and I mean, this goes all the way down to the hunter-gatherer level, they have foods that are accepted and foods that are kind of verboten, and not acceptable to consume. And like within the Hadza communities, the hunter-gatherers in sub-Saharan Africa, like there were adjoining hunter-gatherer bands that would overlap in their ranges. And it was so interesting to read the foods. Well, these guys will eat this, but they absolutely won't eat that. And the people who eat that are like dirty savages. And the dietary practices are an amazing way of distinguishing self from other. And this has interestingly been used in some really horrific examples, like the march up of World War II. Like a huge part of the way that the Nazis vilified the Jews was their butchering practices and whatnot. And the kind of Nazi propaganda was vegetarian in nature, and not many people talk about that. And trying to talk about it in a broader social media context is a great way to get yourself canceled. So it's interesting. And if you want to delete all that stuff out and trim it out, that's absolutely fine by me. Not at all. It is controversial stuff, but in the West, in the United States in particular, the early 1900s, there was kind of a food and spiritual revolution that happened as an outgrowth from the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And not all Seventh-day Adventists feel that the scripture suggests that they should be vegetarian, but some of them do believe that. And this is where like Harvey Kellogg, like the guy that developed the Kellogg's cornflake, there was a thought, and I believe it's true, that like people were told that they needed to not eat animal products and meat in particular because it led to lustfulness and impure thoughts. And so if you ate this super bland vegetarian diet, you would have a low sex drive. And
so funny.
Which is ironic when you peel back, but this was all being put forward as kind of like a moral solution to the degenerating, moral fabric of the world that those folks lived in. And the Seventh-day Adventists basically founded the dietetics movement and have massive influence from every level of kind of the academic consideration of our food system. So you have this religious-based, dim view of animal products that comes from this kind of moralistic perspective, and that really is where the bulk of this stuff came from within Western society and in the United States in particular. And there was kind of an interesting confluence of this stuff where this background information around vegetarianism was kind of gaining some footholds, and it was coming from the Seventh-day Adventist story. And then this was post-World War II and the beginning of kind of the counterculture, and people were starting to push back against a whole host of traditional, American values, and like some insights from Eastern religions, Buddhism and whatnot was starting to kind of make its way into our collective consciousness. And it was right around this time that this guy, Ancel Keys, started thinking about heart attacks and cardiovascular disease rates within, developed countries. And he did some kind of dubious research that suggested that those countries with the greatest fat intake, specifically fat of animal product origin, were experiencing higher heart attack rates. He ended up leaving out a good number of countries that it in such a way that his supposed like line of correlation actually kind of went away to nothing. But all of this kind of came together at the same time. And again, we do a better job in the book of detailing this than what I'm doing now. But there was this kind of interesting sense that traditional values and traditional ways of doing things, including our dietary practices, which were kind of meat-centric, were bad. There was this influence from the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which had a dim view of animal products. And then there was this notion that if we just reduced fat intake and animal product intake, that cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, all these different chronic Western disease processes would decrease. And this all got kind of wrapped together in some modern dietary guidelines. And what's interesting, as these things became formalized and institutionalized, and it went from, I remember when I was a kid, it was the 4 food groups, and then it became My Plate, and now we're 4 food groups, and then the food pyramid, and now I think we're in some sort of My Plate deal or something like that. But what's interesting is, as this thing progressed over time, people ate less protein in general. People ate more sugar. People ate more calories in total, because this also created a fascinating opportunity for the development of the processed food industry. And so there was definitely not some cabal of people like twisting their mustaches thinking about how to ruin the health of the world, but there were a mix of misaligned incentives. I think poor worldview, in the case of the kind of Seventh-day Adventist view of dietary practices and whatnot. But all this stuff kind of came together in a perfect storm, and we have our modern industrial row crop food system that feeds the refined food, junk food industry, the hyper palatable food industry. And the ironic thing is, all of this stuff is propped up by government subsidies, and every single element of media, from social media to the mainstream media, really adopts this narrative that animal products are bad for your health, bad for the environment, that it's accelerating climate change, that is the primary driver of climate change, animal husbandry. And so this is kind of the fight that we have to fight. And some days I really question why I popped my head up on this stuff, but this is where we are, Yeah.
You poked the wrong bear up.
We did. Yeah.
No, it's such an octopus of a complex issue and topic. I think you raised a lot of really interesting points there. And when you're at a dinner party or talking to someone who's not as close to this space, they're a consumer, they're a business owner, or they're an employee, what are some things they can do to try to help, to try to make the situation better, either in their own individual choices and how they spread information to others? What do you recommend?
I'm not entirely sure. I'll be honest, because definitely voting with your dollar is important, but the voting with your dollar thing is challenging, because Bill Gates just told everybody that nobody in a westernized society should eat regular beef. It should only be lab-grown beef. I mean, Bill Gates is a smart dude, very successful. He and his wife's foundation have done amazing things trying to eradicate like malaria in different parts of the world. Like there's some really laudable things there. So shouldn't you follow his advice? And the bugger with that is that I think that again, similar to this ethanol story, it is driving the boat in exactly the wrong direction. So unfortunately, it always sucks to be in a sales position where there's a significant amount of education necessary. Like we were really early in CrossFit. Nobody knew what CrossFit was. So like we did all the heavy lifting of explaining what is CrossFit, and then in the paleo diet scene and whatnot. And so we're in the unenviable position of really needing to educate people on this stuff, because people will put forward very reasonable things. They're like, well, why eat a regular cow? Eat lab-grown meat. And it's like, that seems reasonable. Yeah. But what's interesting, though, is that folks are not aware. And I guess I'm kind of aware of this because I worked in a lab and I understand, what do you need to do to grow tissues in a culture? Well, you need a lab and you need heating and you need cooling and you need antibiotics, because this stuff growing in a petri dish can grow all kinds of shit in there, and a lot of it not good. And oh, by the way, and this is the thing that really trips people up, what is that medium going to grow on? And people act like it's some sort of a saprophytic plant that, like an air fern that just takes nutrients out of the air and grows. But you have to use the industrial row crop food system to grow grains and legumes and process them and turn them into raw chemical substrates to be put into these petri dishes to grow the lab-grown meat. And when you walk people through that, you see this kind of like, oh, I get it, but it's people literally think that it's like, well, you just grow meat in a lab and it just grows. And it's like, well, fuck, like cows out in the environment don't just grow. They need pasture and they need water and they need sunlight. Like there are these inputs that are necessary to make this whole thing go. So I unfortunately, I think that we're in this spot where we really need to educate some folks on this and have discussions around it. And I guess maybe the most important thing that folks could do, in my opinion, is to push back really, really hard against cancel culture and the inability to just have a nuanced discussion around any of this stuff. Because who knows, maybe Diana and I are full of shit and we're totally wrong, but maybe we're not. And maybe we have a global food system emerging that's being run from like the World Health Organization on down to like federal, state, and local levels that is literally just like ass backwards. And we've seen this with like their policies around like cardiovascular disease or whatnot, and cholesterol levels. Like it is still dubious what the relationship is between cholesterol and cardiovascular disease. Like there's a relationship there, but it is not the singular one-to-one relationship that is put forward by the masses. And vegans are not immune to cardiovascular disease, or cancer, or diabetes. So, unfortunately, I would say that folks really need to work on educating themselves. And in that process, again, I'm not saying that I or we are right, but we sure as hell need a venue where we can at least discuss this stuff. And, like 3 years ago, my website saw a 97% reduction in site traffic overnight. And a good number of people in the low carbon regenerative ag space saw the exact same phenomenon. Like we're being shadow banned and we're being blocked from just being able to have this conversation. So, and God,
that's why you started Healthy Rebellion, right?
It is, because we weren't sure if we were ever going to be able to work our way back out of that. And again, I really saw, I was arguably one of the first people that really started experiencing this cancel culture stuff pretty hard. And I had a pretty good sense of how gnarly it could and would eventually get. And so that is why we spun up the Healthy Rebellion. And again, like you start sounding like this kind of Alex Jones conspiracy theorist, but for folks that are out there, listening to this and are like, I don't know, is this guy full of shit or whatever? Like imagine your life's work and your livelihood getting reduced by 97% overnight. And it was Google and Facebook that did it. And what are you going to do next? And again, some people will say, well, you're full of shit and they should be shutting you down. And okay, maybe, or maybe we should be having some really robust discussions around this and looking at the data. I'm proven to be wrong. And then we move forward from there. And we're not really in an environment in which that is the process. The process is that, this quote, science is settled, which science is never settled on much of anything. It's an iterative process, but people are picking winners and losers with very, with pretty remarkably skinny information. And if climate change really is this existential threat, if it really is the scary boogeyman that we're being told, we should really, really vet out what it is that we're doing so that the energy and the resources that we put into it are appropriately placed. And again, I will fall back to this ethanol story, which people just kind of ignore, but it is marketed as a green alternative, but it costs more energy. It costs more fossil fuels to make it than what you get out of it. So we already have a socially accepted government-funded program that's a boondoggle that does not deliver what the label claims. And so why would we not potentially do that again?
Yeah, it's so hard. You make such an interesting point about like the burden is completely on us on this side of the argument to try to educate and try to dispel all the misinformation. And in today's culture, even without the shadow banning, which by the way, I've seen happen to many of my friends and fellow carnivore content creators in the space, across platforms. Even without that, it's very hard to get across in an Instagram post or a story or some quick clip, disentangling all the myths and preconceived notions that people have on, the problems with meat and the sustainability of meat or any of these things. It requires a deeper conversation, and it's really hard to do that in these short snippets. So I really appreciate, things like Sacred Cow, the film and the book, and all the work you're doing, Rob, because it really helps get that message across and educate people. And I think it's making a massive difference.
Well, thank you. And honestly, I mean, like shows like yours are kind of one of the last bastions of people having some degree of freedom to get in and talk about this stuff. So it's thank you for doing what you're doing, because it's a non-trivial risk exposure, you even having this conversation around this.
Yeah, thank you. So shifting topics, we talked a lot about regenerative ag. I want to talk about LMNT a little bit. New sponsor of the show. I've been using the packets for years now, almost every single day, commonly like right when I wake up for workouts, things like that. But it's salt, it's flavored salt. But what inspired you to start LMNT, and maybe why are so many people missing out on electrolytes and the importance of them?
Yeah. The element genesis story is interesting, and I've told this one a lot. And again, it's kind of funny when you do a fair number of shows. You're like, did I mention this one and this one? And but yeah. The long and short of it is just that I've motored along on this low carb LifeWay for 22 years now and generally felt really good, but I had always noticed this kind of lack of a low gear. I do pretty well lifting weights. I do okay doing some low level cardio, but kind of that low gear was missing. And I started hanging out with the founders of Ketogains, Tyler Cartwright and Luis Villaseñor, and they looked at what I was doing and they're like, dude, you're totally spot on, but you need a lot more sodium. And I ignored them for the better part of a year. And then finally, listened to what they were recommending. And it was just like a light switch was flipped. Like it was so profound for me. And I know it's kind of self-serving to say that because I'm the co-founder of this company, but when you think about the fact that every nerve impulse, every muscle twitch, every muscle contraction is driven by sodium potassium pumps, then having your sodium potassium ratio on point really, really matters. And if it's off by some factor, like this is where you can feel really sick or have some significant health problems. I've been noodling on this, and pH is probably even more tightly regulated than electrolyte levels. But, if your pH goes up by too much or down by too much, and it's not that much, you will die. And similarly, if your electrolyte balance gets out of whack, you can get sick or you can end up dying. And what's really interesting to me about all that is that our physiology is much better suited for dealing with too much sodium than too little. If you get too much sodium, Your kidneys will sort that out. It'll retain the potassium and magnesium that it needs to maintain that balance, and you're still pretty good. If you're too low in sodium, it becomes a real remarkable stress on your physiology to right that ship. And this is where people can end up in this kind of downward spiral. And, within the kind of keto, carnivore, low carb space, I think when folks have low insulin levels due to kind of a low glycemic load diet, they usually need even more sodium than what like the average person would potentially need. So it was really identifying what I suspected was a massive need. And then we had the interesting fortuitous situation that most people fear sodium. And so we've had this kind of halo around the product for a pretty good chunk of time, in that it really addresses a need. When people need it and they try something like this, they feel better immediately and they're just kind of bought in. And the flip side of this is that people are so nervous and scared of sodium that there haven't been really that many people entering the scene, or if they do, they really don't get enough sodium in the mix. So it's been a really fascinating process so far.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You talk about the body's self-correcting mechanisms for too much sodium. I have done the extreme end of this. For a period of time, I was consuming 100 grams of salt per day, 40 grams of sodium, and was eating way too much meat because the hyperpalatability of adding salt to everything. Then the large amount of meat all the protein made me pee a lot. So I was excreting a lot of water. So I was drinking more, which was diluting the sodium, which was making me eat more salt. It was this vicious cycle. And I had no idea how much I was consuming. I was being a complete idiot. And I was seeing all these kidney specialists. I had ultrasounds of my kidneys, and they're like, yeah, your kidneys are super healthy. And they were performing exactly what they're supposed to do. And I actually worked with Paul Saladino, and he was like, have you tracked how much salt you're taking in? And I was like, no, I salt my food to taste. I add some to my water before and after workouts, things like that. And it was an immense amount. And I was drinking like 10 liters of water a day. And I just cut back a little bit. It was a little more intelligent about how much salt I was using, back to, like more like 8 to 12 grams, and everything self-corrected.
Oh, dude, that would have been cool to do that in a metabolic ward, assuming you didn't die, and just see what happened.
Yeah.
That's crazy. Wow.
Yeah. So, if you have healthy kidneys, you can take a lot of salt. It's not a problem, at least.
Well, and to that point too, if you have healthy kidneys, you can eat a shitload of protein too, and this is one of the things that gets lost in the shuffle. If you have existing kidney disease, then a very high protein diet can be problematic to deal with that. But that's the thing that usually gets us to the lion's share of kidney disease is either autoimmune or glycemic in nature. It's elevated blood glucose levels.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And Rob, I want to be respectful of your time, but I want to ask you one last question. First of all, this has been fantastic. Really appreciate you coming on the show. I think folks will find this really interesting and want to dig more into these topics. But what legacy is a big one? What legacy do you think you want to leave on the world, or how do you want it to be different when you're gone?
Man, I really hope that the notion of evolution via natural selection really takes its rightful place within medicine and healthcare. Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying, his wife, like they run the Dark Horse podcast. They're evolutionary biologists by training, and they make the same case. And I think that so many of the problems that we face on a healthcare level, on a more global kind of socioeconomic, sociopolitical level, a lot of it is driven by a complete or near complete lack of understanding evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology. And I've beat that drum throughout my career. It hasn't been like the central feature because it's kind of it's a lot to deal with. Like if folks have a religious background, sometimes there's pushback on the topic of evolution. For folks that aren't religious, but just there can be some off-putting features to it because they're like, well, I don't like being defined by my caveman past, or, what have you. It's just some interesting pushback around that. But I think a remarkable amount of suffering occurs from a lack of understanding around this kind of evolutionary biology perspective. And I think if we start, the interesting thing too is that, and I think that this is where like the paleo diet land ran aground and went wrong. The evolutionary framework is for asking questions. It doesn't provide answers, not generally. But God damn, if it's not a great engine for generating the questions that we need to ask and couching it in terms that we can actually get somewhere. Just simply asking the question, how much protein, carbs, fat is optimal for people is not really that helpful because it's just absent this kind of evolutionary context. It's like, well, what type of protein and what type of carbs and under what circumstances, and all these other things. So if I could impart some amount of interest in this evolutionary concept and kind of the broader systems thinking, I think that if people have a decent steeping in basic economics, thermodynamics, and evolutionary biology, they have effectively super skills or superpowers at being able to look at the world. The ironic thing here is that so many people are so deficient in those skills that it doesn't necessarily give you the greatest comparative advantage because you're still fighting the ignorance of everybody else, but I think it does provide a jumping off place that is as close to like magical superpowers as one could generate in this world.
Yeah, I think those are really important kind of meta skills. And for what it's worth, I think you've done an excellent job of promoting those through your work in paleo and just generally after that, talking openly about a lot of these concepts. Well, thank you again, Rob. I really, really appreciate the time today. I think listeners will love this. I will have links, the Healthy Rebellion, Sacred Cow, LMNT, everything in the show notes. Is there anything else you'd like to plug or share?
Nope, that's it. Thank you so much. And anytime you want me to bring down property values again, I will do it. So thank you.
You're always welcome. Thanks again, Rob.
Take care. Bye-bye.
If you enjoy the show, please consider supporting the Carnivore Cast on Patreon. By becoming a patron, you'll help us reach more people and continue to create content on carnivore. There are also exclusive perks available, such as private Q&As, consultations with me, and more. Become a supporter at patreon.com/carnivorecast. Check the episode description for the link. Thank you, and I'll see you there. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Carnivore Cast. If you enjoyed this episode, please review on iTunes. It really helps us out. And share it with a friend. What questions would you like answered? Or who would you like to hear from in the carnivore research community? You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at CarnivoreCast or go to carnivorecast.com. You can also email me at info@carnivorecast.com. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep it carnivore.